All right. Hello, all. Welcome to session 4 of the Intro to AI-Driven Science on Supercomputers. Today, we're going to be diving deeper into large language models specifically. You've had some introduction to neural nets, and now we're going to apply them a little bit more. So for today, our speaker is Archit Vasan, who you can see he's currently on site at Argonne. He will be our presenter today. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. I'll let him introduce himself, a little bit of his scientific background, and then an overview of what we're doing today. One thing to note is for those of you who are already on ALCF systems, you should be able to use them today. Archit can share more specifics. For those of you who are not, you should still be able to use Google Colab to run the notebooks. It may just run a little bit slower. Something that we recognize is that there are some folks who weren't able to get on ALCF systems for one reason or another. That will not prevent you from submitting homeworks for the rest of the series. As we run through for sessions 4 through 7, there will sort of be 2 paths for homework. One of them will be potentially running on a specific machine, and another will not require ALCF machine access, so we're not limiting people on who can get the digital badges or not. If you have more questions on that, feel free to ping me on Slack and I can explain a little bit more. But with that, I'm going to hand things over to Archit.
Hi, everybody. Let me know if you have any trouble hearing me. My name's Archit. Thanks for the introduction page. I'll just give a quick overview of what I do at Argonne. I'm a postdoc here, and I mostly work on drug discovery, so aspects like running chemical language models, simulations, as well as protein language models. And today I'll be talking briefly about language models, so giving you a background on different aspects of language models. So scientific applications of these, a general overview of these transformers, some of the details about preprocessing, so tokenization, delving in a little bit deeper into the model architectures, and then some practical use cases using Hugging Face. However, due to time restrictions, I'm not going to be going into a lot of detail onto the theory of these aspects, but I'll be providing some recommended reading after, where you can get more information about that. And before we begin, everything in this notebook can be run on Google Colab. But if you want to use the Jupyter notebooks, then you would do that just by going to jupyter.alcf.aml.gov, going to the Sophia, and then you can request a Sophia compute node requested by GPU, and then you should find a AI for Science project list here, and you can request a GPU, and you can request for about an hour. And then you would just need to also sync over the repo over to your sync over the repo onto Sophia, and then you can just open the repo directly on the Jupyter notebook here. So and if you want to do this in Google Colab, then you just have to go to Colab, open the notebook, navigate to the GitHub tab, find Argonne LCF AI Science Training Series, and then just open this notebook, O4 Intro to LLMs, Intro to LLMs.ipynb. And so without further ado, I'll just dive into the session. And before I continue, I also want to acknowledge a few people. So I'm going to acknowledge Fernie, Carlo, Shopika, Taylor, Bethany, and Venkat, who've helped me with material for this notebook, as well as discussions on what kind of things to implement. And a lot of this notebook is also inspired by blog posts from Jay Alomar, which is highly recommended reading. Okay, so let's first talk about what language actually is. So if you think about language, really what it is it's a series of words. And so I'm saying this sentence right now, my name is Archit, And the easiest way of breaking that up is into these segments, such as my name is Archit. And mathematically, in language modeling, what they call these is they call these a sequence of tokens. So these would be these tokens listed here. And when I'm speaking, every time I say a word, I'm saying that word because it has some relation to the other words I've already spoken. And so that means that every single word that is in a language has some probability to exist according to the other words within that sequence. And the purpose of sequential modeling is really just to learn the probabilities for all of these possible tokens. So just to understand what's the probability for a new token existing, and can we generate a new token based on that probability. And they're just doing a bunch of fancy stuff in order to kind of achieve this elegant goal. And using this language modeling, we can do a lot of various types of things. So we can generate new text. We can translate language from, let's say, English to French. We can do property prediction. So we can predict, let's say, the toxicity or the positiveness of a sentence. And we can even identify mistakes or some kind of missing element in text. So like a grammar mistake, or maybe there's a line that's missing. And delving even further, we can even apply language modeling to scientific language. So one of the most basic scientific languages out there is the language of DNA. So this is the language of, essentially the language of life. And so we can actually model nucleotide sequences. And we can use this language to predict various types of things like the translation of proteins or mutations that occur in DNA, gene expression levels, and even modeling various diseases. And actually at Argonne, they've undertaken a lot of effort to model these genomes. And they were actually able to model the evolution of SARS-CoV-2 without using a lot of expensive experiments. And so you can see in this diagram, they have different genomes, and they can model what kind of COVID that is, like Delta, Omicron, etc. And going a level higher, we can even use language to model proteins. And so we can model protein language, and we can predict various things like folding, protein-protein interactions, what small molecules bind to these proteins, protein function, and many more properties. And you might be aware that this protein modeling actually recently won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And so I'm showing here ESM2, which is one of a famous example of using a language model to actually predict the structure of a protein. And then some other applications of language modeling in science that go beyond biology is chemistry. You can actually predict various properties of small molecules, their organic chemistry properties. You can even use this in weather predictions or even interfacing with simulations. And so now I'd like to kind of very briefly talk about the kind of high-level review of what these language models are. And for the most part, the language models that exist today base their model on the transformer. So these transformers, this is the architecture that was introduced in 2017 in the Intention is All You Need paper, which is a groundbreaking paper by Vaswani. And since this time, a multitude of multiple LLM architectures have been designed. And so I'm just showing up till 2021 here, but since 2021, there's been several that, I mean, probably thousands of models that have been added to this list. And so now that I've introduced a little bit about this, let's take a quick break and let's look at an example of actually running inference with an LLM as a black box in order to generate text given a prompt. And here we'll be using the transformers library, which is part of Hugging Face, which is a very powerful toolkit for these language models. Also, before you begin, just keep in mind that the language models that we'll be using here are really only as good as their training data. So they don't really have ethics or these judgments built in. So run the next part at your own discretion. And you would just uncomment this below section if you're running this on a Sophia Jupyter notebook. This is just adding some HTTP proxies here. But if you're running this on Colab, then feel free to run without uncommenting this. So the first step is just install the development packages. And then you're going to import auto tokenizer and its auto model for causal LLM from transformers. And I have imported I'm using a prompt, so I'm trying to keep the prompt as vanilla as possible. My dog really wanted to eat ice cream because. And then you import this pipeline. And then I'm using this GPT-2 model, which is a relatively small but still informative model, still a useful model. And then generating output text using this model with a max length of 20. And so you should end up with a few with 5 different responses here, and they should be different than the ones that I provided. And so you might see that some of these responses don't really make that much sense. And so my dog really wanted to eat ice cream because the owner couldn't get it in the store if he needed it. I mean, that doesn't. It makes sense. Like each sentence, each word makes sense, but there's actually ways that you can tune these language models. And so because we see that we can generate this text from these models, and sometimes we might want to improve it, it's important to know what's actually going on under the hood. So what is actually, how are these models actually processing this information, outputting the text? And so let's go forward and let's talk about what's actually going on under the hood here. So what are the 2 components that actually make up this language generation? So the first thing is how is the language actually preprocessed? So this is what is known as tokenization. So tokenization is essentially how you can take in this data. So this language data, and how does the machine actually understand that data? And so if I were to ask a person, let's say, how they understand language, so how they understand the words that I'm saying right now, this would be because they've already learned these phonetic sounds. So either through school or growing up with their families, they've learned kind of the phonetic rules of English. But an algorithm doesn't have this luxury. So it doesn't have the luxury of knowing these rules without being told what the rules are. And so these rules of phonetics are what the algorithm calls a tokenizer. Or to put this more concretely, this is a data preprocessing step that will just take in raw text data. So it'll take in data like my dog really wanted to eat ice cream, and it'll figure out a way to chunk this up, into vectors that the machine can actually learn on. And then these tokens are what are then fed into the language model. And based on the type or the configuration of the tokenizer, these tokens can actually represent different things. So you can take a sentence like, this is tokenizing, and you can tokenize it in actually multiple different ways. So you can represent this is tokenizing as characters. So this would be just splitting it into these individual characters. Or you can do this a level up, which is splitting this into separate words. So this would be, this is tokenizing. But there are some caveats for both of these approaches. So a caveat for the word approach is that you'll have to have a very, very large vocabulary here, because you're essentially saying that there's a new word for this, there's a new word for is, there's a new word for tokenizing. And so that's a difficulty of using word tokenizers. And on the other hand, character tokenizers would have a small vocabulary, but you see that there's not really any real meaning behind the letter T or the letter I in the context of the other words. And so an alternative approach is to use solid word tokenizers. So this is essentially will take text and it'll split that into different units. And so, for example, you can take, this is tokenizing, and you could split this into, let's say, a morpheme, where this is, and then token is represented here, and then IZING would be represented as its own token here. This is an alternative method which is used to possibly decrease the, or to increase the meaning for each of these tokens in this in this sequence. So I'm going to take another coding break, and we can actually look at an example of tokenization in action. And we can use, we can look at a subword tokenizer called a byte pair encoding text tokenizer. And once again, for the sake of time, I'm not going into a lot of detail on the theory behind how each of these different tokenizers is working, but you can refer to the recommended reading at the end to see that. So in this example, yeah, I'm showing a byte pair encoder tokenizer. And so the first step here would be to import the auto tokenizer, which is a method in the Transformers toolkit. And I'm creating a function. So this is a tokenization summary function here, where first it'll import a tokenizer. So this would be a tokenizer, kind of a pre-trained tokenizer within this, this Transformers toolkit. And sequence would be any sequence that you want to tokenize. So any kind of sentence that you want to tokenize. The first step here would be you could get the vocabulary by doing vocab equals tokenizer.vocab. And then we'll be printing out just a subset of the tokenizer vocabulary in order to see what's included. And we can also print out the vocabulary size of the tokenizer here. And then you would take in the sequence, so the sentence that you want to tokenize, and just do a tokenizer dot tokenize that sequence. And then we're here printing out the tokens from this. And so we can then print out the tokenized sequence as a vector. This is tokenizer that encodes the sequence. And we can also print out the decoded sequence right here. And in this example, I'll be using the GPT-2 tokenizer. It's the very popular model. And we'll be using as an example this sequence. Counselor, please adjust your zoom filter to appear as a human rather than as cat. And you'll see that there's, so this would be the subset of the tokenizer vocabulary, so just a subset of random tokens within this vocabulary. And we'll see that what's something that's kind of interesting here is that a few of these tokens have this G with a dot on top of them, and some of them don't. So what's interesting about this is that the tokens that don't have a G with a dot, so the tokens that do have the G with a dot are tokens that actually have a space before this token. So ghosts would have a space before that. But then tokens like foo, those would be common elements that are usually actually put together with another token. So if you look at this example, counselor, please adjust your zoom filter. The tokens count and sell and or, they all are pieces of the word counselor. Whereas the word please adjust, those are all their own words. And so these would be the tokens that are extracted out of the sentence. And then you can take these tokens and you can then, what's happening here is you're actually identifying their index. So you have a vocabulary, which is like a large dictionary. And the index is essentially just the page number for a particular word, or like a line number for that particular word. And so you can take the word count, or the token count, and find where it's listed in that vocabulary, or the token cell and where it's listed. And then you can then create a tokenized sequence using that. And then this vector can then be sent into the rest of the language model for doing more processing. And you can see that you can easily take this tokenized sequence and then decode it back into the original sentence. So you can then take these tokens, and as I mentioned, you can then put them into the language model. And so one thing I'll kind of briefly talk about is what's known as token embedding. So we have these vectors here. We know that this is an index for this token. That's another index. But these indices don't really mean anything for each of these tokens. So there's an extra step, which is called token embedding, which can actually take vectors. So it can take these tokens, and they can learn the best position for each of these tokens relative to each other. And so this is important because you want to embed your tokens in such a way that tokens that have the same meaning are clustered in one space versus another. So I can actually quickly show you what I mean by this. So here we're doing this tokenization. And also, please stop me if you have any questions. So yeah, we're doing this tokenization, and let's say we tokenize the word king, and we have an index for the word king. So we have the word king. This token embedding, you're doing this so that the vector for the word king, it should lie close to the vector for the word queen. But it should lie further away from the word, sorry, my handwriting is not too desired. It should lie further away from the word it. And so this is the first step within the model. This is the first thing that it's doing, to actually take in these vectors and extract some kind of meaning from each of these indices. And that would be essentially just projecting them into the space, and so that there's a new vector where tokens that are closer to each other are mapped closer to each other in this space.
Archit, we have one question on Slack.
Yeah,
That is good.
Okay.
It was asked, would the lowercase and uppercase of the same subword be counted as the same tokens or different? Or would they have different indices?
That's a very, very good question. So I think, so tokenization really is up, in many senses, it's up to how you want to tokenize that sentence. And so if it's a word, let's say counselor, then this phrase count, I don't think it would be, I don't think GPT-2 would be tokenizing this differently in this different space. So in this case, the word count, you would have a positional encoding. So you would say like it's the first sentence within there. But then if counselor is somebody's name, then it's possible you could design your tokenizer such that names actually have, like, let's say the name counselor might be different from the lowercase counselor. So I think that's just saying that it really depends on how you design your tokenizer. So in this case, like let's say Zoom. Zoom is actually a very common like word that has an uppercase, whereas it's also a very common word that has a lowercase. And so I would expect that there would be also a lowercase Zoom as a token. And so yeah, you could end up with both uppercase and lowercase tokens. That's a really good question, actually. Did that answer the question, or?
I think so far so good. I think we can continue on.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, so I'm just gonna delete this, and we can move on to talking a little bit more about the actual transformer model architecture. And so once again, there's a lot of details here that I'll be kind of going over pretty quickly. But yeah, there's a lot of resources in order to learn more about the theory here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the model ourselves, and so we can just take this transformers toolkit, and we can import the GPT-2 tokenizer and the. I'm looking here at the LM head model, because this will actually let us look at what's actually within the model itself. So we can then load in from pre-trained GPT-2, and we're just going to print out the model and see what's inside of it. And so when you print this out, you'll see that there's a lot of things that make sense. So a lot of things you've encountered before, like dropout or normalization, or I guess the convolution also. There are also things that you might not have encountered before. So one would be the embedding. So embedding is what I just talked about. This embedding the tokenizer in a way that the words that are, or the tokens that are closer to each other are embedded closer in that space. There's also WPE. So that would be a positional encoder. That way you know which word is coming first or second in that sentence. And there's some other things here. So there's also things like attention mechanisms. So let's see if I can find that within here. Yeah, you see there's something called attention. So I'll talk about that in some more detail also. And the model that I'm showing here is actually, it's what's known as a transformer decoder. So this is a model that's used to generate text. And so it's called a decoder because it has what's called a decoder layer. And so this decoder layer, and these models are also called autoregressive models. These decoder models really, they take in a sentence and their main purpose is just to predict what is the next token within that sentence. And so if you see here, you have the word robot must obey, and it'll use the information from these tokens, robot must obey, and predict the next word, which is orders. And it does this by just feeding in this sequence into a series of different layers, and then predicting out the next word, which would be orders from there. And these layers, or what are known as transformer blocks, consist of multiple components. So each of these blocks consists of a self-attention layer, followed by a feed-forward neural network. So you're all familiar with feed-forward neural networks because that's been introduced since the first part of the series. But the new thing that here is this masked self-attention. And this is used to allow the model to weigh the importance of different words in a sentence. So it can capture the important contextual information in that sentence. And then that's then fed into this feed-forward, which can process the information from the self-attention layer to generate an output. So that's actually the thing that will generate the output and will lead to predicting the next word. But let's talk about this self-attentional in a little bit more detail, because this is kind of in my opinion, the most powerful aspect of these transformers, and what kind of sets them apart from all the other models that have been introduced. So let's talk about these attention mechanisms, and let's use a very simple example. Let's use this sentence. The animal didn't cross the street because it was too tired. And let's ask the question about how does this actually, like, how would the model actually understand this full sentence? What does it need to know? So it needs to know a few things. It needs to know first, what is the meaning for each of these words? So what's the meaning for the word the? What's the meaning for the word animal? The meaning for the word street or tired? And so once it's done that, it also needs to know what is the position for each of these words. So which word occurs first? The animal didn't cross the street. And so the first two things that the model needs to know, those are taken care of with the input embedding or the token embedding, which tells you the meaning for each of the words, followed by the positional encoding, which tells you the position for the words. So which word occurs first and second. But there's another thing the model needs to know. It also needs to know context. So it needs to know what do each of these words refer to. We can ask the question, let's look at the word it. What does it mean? Is it the street? So is the street the thing that's tired? Or is it cross? Is cross tired? No, since we speak English, we know that it refers to animal. That's the thing that makes most sense, because street can't actually get tired. But the model doesn't really know this. The model needs a way to actually learn this information in a simple yet generalizable way. And so the transformer idea is that they're able to learn this information using the attention mechanism. And so all the attention mechanism is doing is it's taking in a token. So for example, the token it, and it's looking at the context. So it has a way to evaluate the context for it with all of the other tokens within that sequence. So the context of it to thee, or to the animal, or to didn't, or to cross the street. And you'll see that when you look at this attention here, it has a very high attention with the animal, whereas it has a lower attention with street. And so this way the model has established that it refers to the animal here. However, usually this can be much more complex. And so you can actually run into an issue where when you're trying to establish this context, you might actually just get into a situation where it has the most context with itself. And so in order to mitigate this problem, the problem of kind of having attention by itself, and also increasing the ability for each of these tokens to attend to other things within that sentence, we can actually use multiple attention heads. So multiple attention heads basically just means doing this attention mechanism a bunch of different times to see, to get like a picture of this attention, and then just taking all these attentions and aggregating them all together at the end. And so this, once again, will expand the model's ability to focus on different positions and different attentions. And so that was kind of an abstract way of looking at this. Now we can see these multi-head attention mechanisms in action. So we can actually see what this means. And to do this, I'll be using a very powerful tool, BirdViz. So BirdViz is basically just a tool that lets you analyze different aspects of these transform models. And the thing that I'll be looking at in particular right now is looking at the attention mechanism. I'm looking at the multi-head attention mechanism. So what we'll be doing first is we'll be taking in once again, loading in all of the required aspects of this transformers toolkit. So the auto tokenizer, the auto model, utils, auto model for causal LLM. And then you'll be installing BirdViz. So just let me know after you have any trouble installing BirdViz. And then we're going to be loading in the model OpenAI, so the OpenAI AI model GPT-2. And we'll be using as an input text, "No, I am your father," which is the common phrase from Star Wars. And we can then load in the model, and then we're outputting the attention. So we're outputting this self-attention here. Then we can encode the input text, run the model, and we can then look at the attentions through this. And so you can see that this is going to be and this is really cool because you can actually see what's going on inside the model itself. So you can see, you can actually click on each of these different blocks here. And what these blocks are, and it's pretty cool, is that each of these blocks is going to be a different head. So I mentioned that you have these attention heads. So each of these blocks is one of these guys. So each of these blocks is going to be one of these, this example here. And you're just replicating this a bunch of times. Or so the model's replicating this a bunch of times. And so you can look at this and you can see that there's actually quite a bit of stochasticity. You can see the word "no" here has a very strong attention with the other word "no" right there, but it doesn't have a lot of attention with anything else here. So this is something that we realize is kind of a problem, is that we want "no" to have attention with the other words in that sentence, not just with itself. So we can find an example, and maybe maybe that's a bad example to use, because I think maybe the model didn't do a great job actually at this particular token. Let's look at another token, I. So I has a lot of context with no, but if you look at a different attention, so if you look at, let's say, this one right here, then I might have more with this comma right there. And so this is really cool because it lets you know, like, first off, it also lets you know where is the model possibly making, what are the limitations of the model. So you can see here that the word no, it has a lot of attention just with the word no. And so by using this toolkit, we can actually diagnose some of the possible issues with that model. So yeah, we're giving you this as a homework example later on to try out some different models and see if you can identify how the attention mechanisms are changing for each of these different models. And you can also play around with whichever prompt you want, so whichever input text that you want to play around with here. But I hope that this is at least illustrated kind of what these attention mechanisms are to some degree. We can understand what is actually happening here, and that these models are trying to just establish a context between the different words within that sentence. And so I can also stop for some questions if there are any questions at this point before I continue to the next part.
There was one question in reference to vocabulary from a little bit ago. It asked, when you say vocabulary size, is the size of the token, is it the size of the token space or the size of the actual vocabulary?
That's a good question. So it'd be the size of the actual vocabulary. So it'd be the size of taking all of the words and then splitting them into their unit tokens. So like you have these words like, let's go back to this example here. You have these words like, counselor, please adjust your zoom filter to appear as a human. And so the vocabulary size would be the size of including all of these sub-split words here. So that would be the full vocabulary. It would be, counselor, please adjust your zoom filter, but doing this across every single word that's within essentially the real dictionary. And so that's why the vocabulary size here would be 50,257.
Wonderful. Another question, could you please elaborate on multi-head attention? Does each attention head focus on different aspects of learning?
Yeah, so exactly. So multi-head attention, it's exactly that. So it's because this is all kind of this learning is stochastic, right? And so these multi-heads, it's learning stochastically using the kind of atom or whatever optimizer you're using. And so you're just learning these different contexts. And so each head will be learning different contexts because they'll all be trained together. And so you might learn like different contexts here. You might learn that it responds to this thing, didn't, or it responds to this thing here too. And so that's what the multi-head attention is doing, is it's basically letting you increase, it's almost just increasing the sampling of these different contexts between the tokens within a sentence. And so yeah, it's doing the same thing, each of them doing the same thing, but it's doing this because there's a stochasticity, and so you just increase the sampling size. It's like throwing a bunch of dice in a sense. If that makes sense.
I think maybe one more question and then we can continue on.
Sure.
Given that these are autoregressive models, how does the attention work during inference? Since it can't see the words ahead of it, so no context?
So yeah, that's a really good question. So they're autoregressive, but they can see the words before. And so the idea is that you want to generate new words. So let's go back up here. And you can see that robot must obey. So this, when you're generating a new like word right here, you do have the context for the previous words. So you do know that there's attention between all of these guys. And so the idea is then during the inference, you have this attention that you're already modeling. And you're modeling this step by step. And so you model this thing, and then you have the attention to this guy. And then you can then model out, you get essentially the, from the feed-forward neural network, you'll get a series of what are called budgets. And this could establish some probability for each of the tokens. And you can then take out the token that has a high probability. And that's the reason why this is called masked self-attention, because you're just doing the self-attention, but you're just doing it so that you only have the attention with words that occurred like previously in that sequence. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and next week we'll cover RAGs, which also help provide context in terms of when you're running inference.
Yeah. Yeah. What Venkat mentioned is fair. Yes, next week we're running like this retrieval augmented generation with Shopika, and that'll help out with the with actually doing this inference. And that's something that you're going to learn next week. Are there any more questions or?
That's all for now.
Okay. All right, so now let's do the arguably the fun part. This would be the actual, the practical aspect of this. This is doing things like setting up a prompt, loading in a pre-trained model, loading a tokenizer, actually performing the inference, and then interpreting the output of this. And yeah, we're just using a few canned prompts here, but feel free to use the prompts that you like if you want to in this example. So the first step is what exactly is a prompt? So I'm sure you've all, I don't know if you still have the essays on the SAT, but like when I was going to undergrad, I had to take the SAT exam, and they asked these ridiculous prompts. Like, I don't know, what is the meaning of, I don't know, whatever. But that's basically what this is. It's just an input or a query that's provided to the language model, and they guide the text processing, or they guide the generation. And so you can have an input text such as the panoramic view of the ocean is breathtaking. And all this is doing is it's telling the model, okay, take in this input text and then generate something that has some attached meaning to this input text. Or it could also ask, oh, is this a good sentence or is this a bad sentence? But actually, these prompts can get even more complicated. So you can have, and you actually learn a lot more about this in the next session, which is prompt engineering. So that's actually how you can choose your prompt in a way that you can actually get the results that you want. Because this kind of prompt is extremely simple, but you can actually change the prompt to actually help your help get what you want from the model. And then the next step after this would be, this is the prompt, and then the next step is just to load in a pre-trained model. So here we're using pre-trained models. In principle, you can train your own model, but people usually don't do that. They'll usually do things like fine-tuning, which is like taking a pre-trained model and then like maybe adding some more data and then training a little more on that. But also commonly what's done is just taking a pre-trained model and running inference for that pre-trained model. And the model that I'll be using here is this auto model for sequence classification. And this is going to be a sequence classification model. But if you want to use a different model, which I think you should play around with, you can actually refer to this link on Hugging Face. Look at a bunch of different models that are supported. And so what this will be doing is you'll first specify the model that you want to download. So I'm using this model, Stolbert. And you can set up a config. And that's basically just printing out the configuration of that model. So what are all the aspects of that model? you can see that the model has various different things. So you can see what is the activations, what are the activation functions you can use in that model, what is the kind of the general architecture of the model, what are things like dropouts, hidden dimensions, positional embedding space. I mean, a lot of things here that probably will like, but you can see the kind of the details of the model here. You can also see the number of heads in that model, number of layers in that model by doing this. So then the next step after loading in the model will be to load in the tokenizer. So this is just the tool that'll take in the input sequences, and it'll take that and return that into a vector form that the model can actually use and process. So here we're just going to be using the standard tokenizer from Distolbert and tokenizing this input text and returning out the input IDs here. And so these input IDs are once again just going to be the indices within that vocabulary. And the final step is just to perform the inference and interpret the results. So we can load this data into the model. So remember, we've created these input IDs here, which is the tokenized prompt. We can then load them into the model, and we can get what's known as the output logits. So these output logits would just be this result right here. You can see right there. And then we can then convert this result into probabilities. So these are probabilities. And what's also important to note here is that the model that I showed earlier is a generative model. But this is actually a different type of model. So this is going to be a classifier model. And so this is kind of a subtlety that I don't think we have the time to delve into, but you have decoder, but you also have encoder models. And so this model that I'm using in this example is actually not going to be a like an autoregressive model. This is going to be a model that actually will look at the whole sentence and predict and actually classify that sentence. And so we can take out the probabilities, where the probabilities are going to be the labels negative or positive. And we can establish probabilities for negative or probabilities for positive. And we see that there's a probability that's higher, much higher for positive for the sentence. And so we have a label positive with a score of 0.999. And so you can play around with this, and you can actually you can try any sentence that you want here to see if that sentence can be positive or negative using this model. So final thing I want to show is that not only can you load in these models for inference, but in case, let's say, you want to train or to fine-tune the model, you can also use this Hugging Face transformers in order to also to save your own local model. So you can save your own local model into, let's say, some kind of directory, and you can load in that model whenever you want to actually use it, using this kind of code architecture here. And so this is really powerful because this is probably the base kind of toolkits that you need to start running and start playing with these models on your own. So another place to look that's really powerful is the Model Hub. And so the Model Hub is just a place where like the members of the Hugging Face community can host their model checkpoints for different discovery and for sharing with others. And there's also a lot of tools and documentation on Hugging Face for how to actually use these different models. So this ends kind of the main aspect of this talk, but there's a lot of details that, once again, I had to look at very high levels. So things like the details of attention mechanisms and details of positional encoding, token encoding. To learn more about the theory, I would definitely refer to these blog posts by Jay Alomar. Those are really great. And our Argonne National Lab actually has had LLM tutorials in the past, so you can also refer to those as well for some more theory here. But now, yeah, I'll take some more questions if there are any more questions. And then I'll talk about the homework.
Nothing currently in the chat, but so maybe move to homework and then I'll keep an eye out for questions.
Sure, okay. So yeah, the homework, so I just have a couple of homework assignments for you. One is to use this Hugging Face pipeline. So the one that I talked about here, that's that I was using this this classifier model. I want you to use a generative model. So to use a model such as I think use GPT-2 as a last resort, but a model such as, let's say, this Microsoft 5.3 Mini 4K Instruct, and try and generate new text, and also use a batch of prompts. So use several prompts. So not just use one prompt, but use let's say like 10 prompts or 16 prompts here, and generate text for each of them. And I want you to play with some other parameters. So play with things like the max new tokens. So this max new tokens is basically telling you how many tokens you output from the model. You can also play with the model itself. So you can have you can use different models. And also play with the temperature. So temperature is something very interesting. Temperature is essentially telling you how stochastic is the result from the Hugging Face generation. So with a higher temperature, you're going to have a more random prediction. And so I can actually show you an example here. If we change the temperature for this example right here, let's see, hopefully this works properly. I'm going to have to rerun this actually. So what you should end up seeing is that if you, let's say we change the temperature here to 90, we should end up with a very random result. And so that's what the temperature is controlling. It's essentially controlling the stochasticity of the output. So I'll let this run and then come back to it.
Another question in
Yeah,
Slack.
Sure.
Someone asked, is the positive or negative here for whether or not the prompt is well formed?
So the positive or negative is for the toxicity of the result. So is it a is it positive or is it a negative sentiment? So like kind of the emotion behind the prompt. But you can I mean it depends on how you train the model. And so there are some models that do train for is it a good prompt or not. But for this particular case, it's trained for is the result negative or is it positive? Or like negative as in like is it negative? Like is it like a mean thing to say or is it a nice thing to say? Okay, and then yeah, the second homework assignment is just to load in two models. So to load in, for example, GPT-2 or DistillBERT or DistillGPT-2, and then analyze the BERT viz for each of them. So how would the attention mechanism change depending on kind of the size of the model or the type of model? And you can just write a little bit about what the differences for these different attention mechanisms. So I think with this, yeah, I'll more than happy to take more questions at this point. But I think, yeah, I think I covered most of the aspects of the talk. If there's anything that anybody wants me to go over in some more detail, then I'm happy to go over that as well.
It doesn't look like we have any specific questions right now in the chat. Oh, we have maybe one coming in.
Okay.
But I think we have about 10-ish more minutes. Oh, actually, we have a question somebody just asked. Yeah, Yue, go ahead. Feel free to unmute if you'd like.
Hi there, Archit. I was wondering for like genomic sequence modeling, do you generally use codon-based tokenization or more like RNA-based sequence or RNA sequence-based tokenization? And if it's the RNA sequence-based, do you also use like the start codon and end codon tokens attached to those, like improve performance, or is there like a general go-to for that?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I think I'm not the best person to ask because I don't do the genomic modeling but as far as I understand, they mostly use these codon-based tokenization. That's like that's a good way of segmenting this genomic data because if you go back here, because you already kind of have this this kind of built-in like biological meaning behind each of these different nucleotides, and so you know that each codon does represent an amino acid. And so, from what I understand, they would typically use these the codon level. But then, in terms of stop codons and start codons, I think they would use that too. So that could be used to indicate like a stop or a start for some kind of like amino acids, for example.
Okay, yeah, thank
But yeah,
you.
yeah, of course, yeah.
And expanding on that, so is there generally a length for tokens, like how long they should be to encode enough information to be usable? Because it seems like if you're using individual letter based, like for language, if you're using individual letters, you don't get a lot of that information that's within like the pieces of words. So is there like a general rule of thumb for that, or anything in that regard?
That's a very good question. So you're saying like the length, you're saying the length of a token, or the length of a sequence is your question?
Well, I mean, I guess it would be both, right? So, like for each individual symbol, you're not getting much information out of that symbol. But when you combine those symbols to be like substrings or codons, then you're getting more information, and that's generally you see that being like better performance than the individual like pieces, like letters or not amino acids, but sorry,
Yeah.
vacuum.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, like I think stringing these together definitely increases the value. I don't know if there's like a rule of thumb for how many things should be strung together for a particular like, but because sometimes you might have a sentence where like the word a might just be a very common word that's used by itself, for example. And so that's why you would tend, I think these byte pair encoders are really powerful. So for genomic modeling or protein modeling, it's kind of understood that, okay, there are these kind of biological sequences. But then let's go to, let's say, chemical modeling, where we have, like, say, a small molecule. And there you don't really have, like, any kind of chemical intuition for what is a token. And they're using a byte pair encoder, where you're learning the proper pattern of like strings that come together to form a one token. That I think is the way to go there. But then to answer your second question, which is the size of a sequence, I mean, as far as I'm aware, I think I would say better to have a smaller. Yeah.
It depends, I would say that. When you're looking at large viruses, you're trying to see as long sequences that you can fit. So E. coli and others, I think one of the grand challenges of you're looking at, we've worked on mechanisms to incorporate really large sequences. So there are sequence parallelism techniques, various compressions that can fit in really long sequences. There are, I would say, in some of the gene sequence modeling, we've targeted sequence lengths of up to 500K sequence lengths. Now, when that gets tokenized and it's slightly smaller, but then I think the holy grail that we want to really target is, a few million plus.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I guess it's very problem dependent in that if you have a long sequence, then you want bigger tokens to encode bigger chunks of data so you can kind of process it faster, or else it would be taking forever to compute. All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We have another question. Why were the locations of tokens in the vocabulary single numbers? I thought the tokens are embedded in multi-dimensional space.
Oh, that's a good question. So, so you're asking about the indices here. So those indices are the vocabulary index. So this isn't going to be the final embedding. That's something different. So, and also the embedding isn't going to be in two-dimensional space. It's actually in a multi-dimensional space, and so it's a much larger space. This right here is just the placement for the. So let me draw a picture actually to help out here. So this is sort of this is just telling you you have a list of tokens. So this is a list. This is another token. It's another token. This is another token, and this is just saying, okay, this is the first token in that list. There's just a second, and then this is, say, the nth token in that list. So that's all this is telling you right here. But then what's happening is you can model out and you can model out where is each of these tokens located within an embedding space. And so let me draw this in 3 dimensions so you can see. But this is actually just a representation of a multidimensional space. You can see that this could be lying here, let's say. And so this thing right here could be lying in this space in the 3-dimensional space. So this index right here isn't going to be the embedding. This is just the location within that vocabulary. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So that's the that's the reason why these indices are one-dimensional here.
Excellent, thank you. It looks like right now we don't have any other active typers, so I think we can probably end things here with you. So thank you so much, Archit, today. For folks who have other questions as they're going through homework or as they're going through notebooks, obviously feel free to drop them in Slack as always, and Archit and others will come and answer them. But with that, we're going to transition to our science talk today. Today we have Nicola Ferrier here. Nicola is a senior computer scientist as part of the Mathematics and Computer Science division at Argonne. Her research interests are in the use of computer vision to control robots, machinery, and devices with the applications as diverse as medical systems, manufacturing, and projects that facilitate scientific discovery. Today, she's going to be talking about AI at the edge specifically. And I will hand it over to her.
Hi, let me just share my screen. Where is the right correct? Sorry, I've got too many PowerPoints open. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm going to talk about a project that is an Argonne project with a lot of collaborators at Northwestern University, UCSD, and other places. And we really are interested in deploying AI at the edge. So pushing AI out to remote locations where data can be collected. So what is this platform that we're developing at Argonne or have developed at Argonne? It's called Waggle. Waggle is the internal architecture that has been built. It's consists of both hardware and software. The edge software stack is all of the typical AI tools that you've been learning about, but it also includes a scheduler, resource manager, support for multi-tenancy on our devices, cybersecurity, data movement, data storage and management. So we have these nodes, which there are two shown here. One is the custom-built node that we deploy to remote locations. It consists of this box that has two computers in it, actually, and then this particular node has a camera here, and a weather station here that has a bunch of different sensors in it. But you can connect up any sensors you want as long as they're power over Ethernet. So you can add other sensors to the nodes. But we also have nodes that look more like just a commodity server, because many of the locations, there's a rack that you can deploy a node there. So even though it's out at the edge, mountaintops in California, you can actually install just a commodity server, but it runs the same software stack. So this is a node up on a mountaintop in California that has a camera looking out here to search for wildfire. So this is the architecture that we've developed. And the goal of the whole project is, we call this a software-defined sensor. So if you think about science, there's a lot of things that you can buy a sensor. You can buy a temperature sensor, you can buy a humidity sensor, you can buy a lot of sensors, but there are a lot of things you want to measure that you can't actually buy a sensor for. And so, but you can compute what you want using right now powerful AI tools, but as long as you have images, microphones, other data sources, you can actually develop your own sensor with software. So some examples here are what species of plant is growing, do bike share users wear helmets or not. We have a project where we're looking at classifying weather in order to actually better interpret your LiDAR for if it's raining or not, how you interpret the LiDAR data changes. You can monitor traffic patterns. You can look at cloud type. You can look for smoke. You can say, are the streets flooding? So these are examples where you can't go out and buy a sensor, but you can develop AI tools that will allow you to use sensors like cameras or microphones, and then write the software to be able to answer specific science questions. So some examples of things we've done, we have cameras that are deployed in and around O'Hare Airport. For those of you from Chicago, you know that it's miserable traffic around Chicago O'Hare. And there's studies going on to really look at how to change patterns, improve energy utilization. So simple AI models like YOLO, plus some tracking, allow you to grab a bunch of measurements about the flow of traffic. And we even actually, as part of this, have a model that tells you whether the vehicle has a rideshare sticker. So it can actually grab the front windshield on rear and figure out whether a vehicle is actually Lyft or Uber. We don't know if it's operating as Lyft or Uber, but we can do those measurements. We've got nodes. We work on a project with Berkeley Lab where we're attaching radiation sensors. And the goal here is to really understand whether vehicles or persons moving around the city, is that radiation medical isotopes because you're near a hospital or an ambulance, or is it potentially a bad actor? And so by connecting up LiDAR cameras and radiation sensors, we're looking at can we make cities safer from potentially dangerous radioactive materials? Surface water is a big problem in the Chicago area. There are many parts of the city that flood every time there's heavy rain. So we're working with hydrologists and trying to look at, is there standing water on the street? And, what can be done, or, building better models to be able to predict standing water after rainfall and eliminate some of the flooding risks in the city of Chicago. Wildfire is a big issue now. We have nodes deployed in Oregon and in California that are looking for smoke and potential fires. We actually collected a bunch of data in a controlled burn at a prairie to actually explore whether or not infrared cameras would be more or a good augment to regular cameras. And then about a year after that data collection and analysis, one of our nodes in Oregon, you can see the top, these are the same moment in time, the top view, you can see that there's smoke, but it's really interesting. You can see all the hot spots in infrared. So infrared cameras are a lot more expensive. And a lot of times the cameras that are out there looking for smoke and wildfire do get destroyed. So we were trying to ascertain, and we're still working on whether it's worth the extra cost, but it does seem from our preliminary work that this would be a better way to look for fire. Another example, working with Exelon here, they have solar facilities. They want to be able to better predict when there's going to be a change in production. And that is often due to a large cloud bank coming and covering up a solar field. So using the cameras to look at cloud coverage and then correlating that and building a model that relates it to the solar irradiance allowed us to do some prediction of whether or not there was going to be a change in production from a local solar facility. Okay, so all of these examples are things you've been looking at AI and these are all supervised learning examples. And so in that previous example, we had these two nodes. There's an upward facing node on a camera, or camera here on a node, and then there's actually a solar irradiance device that we had co-located. We grabbed a bunch of images. They were manually labeled as to whether they were cloud or not, and then we combined it all, built a model based on that, and then we could use that model to deploy to the edge. But this is somewhat tedious. The process of labeling images or labeling audio is very, very tedious. So in the park example, someone had to go through and label whether there's standing water or not, or whether there's cloud or not. So for science, we don't have large data sets yet. I mean, it's getting better, but we don't have large data sets of seismic measurements or, photovoltaics in the solar example, or is rime ice building up on this electrical equipment, which could then cause a problem. We don't have those data sets, and manually doing it is possible. We have all the infrastructure in place. If you have that, if you have the effort to do the labeling, we have methods that people can train a model and deploy a model. But ultimately, to really scale this, we need more. So scaling AI, we're right now at hundreds of nodes. We'd like to, or about 150 nodes. We'd like to go to hundreds, maybe thousands of nodes. But having scientists do this task, we've discovered, is not straightforward. It's tedious to do the labeling. Building the model is not always in the scientist's skill set. So then they have to find someone to help them build the model. And so we're exploring ways that we can use our infrastructure, but encourage more people to be able to come and use a node, build a model, have it running, and collect their data for them to address their science question. So these supervised learnings were, they're problematic from scaling to other problems, but there are other techniques like self-supervised learning that are well suited to actually doing this on the edge. So one example, so you've been, I think, learning a little bit about large language models. The transformer-based method, or the way they're trained, is often holding out some tokens from a stream of text. In the visual field, you can do similar things. There's visual transformers. And here what we do for self-supervised learning is you present two images to a student and a teacher, we call them, but one is an augmented, rotated, scaled, cropped version of the image. And we tell the model, the system, these are the same thing. So it eventually has to learn what is this thing. So these are actually called attentional maps that are built up. And what we have found, that if we run self-supervised learning on data that we collect at the edge, if you look at the embedding vectors, or sort of the final layers of the network, these are representations of what's in the images. And we can do clustering on those, and we could actually build up models. We were able to actually do a really good job with the clouds. We also took a self-supervised learning approach to study audio signals. So very close to Argonne, there's the Morton Arboretum. There's a bunch of data collected there, audio data, converted to images, spectrograms. This is a spectrogram here. And we then did this same process of self-supervised learning. In the advantage of using audio here is that there are trained models. There's an app you can get for your phone from Cornell, the Merlin Bird ID. We use that to validate our results. But what we were able to do is do the self-supervised learning and clustering. Here you see a 2D projection of a many-dimensional space, but the ellipsoids here are actually distinct regions in that embedding space. And when we look at what we find within those groupings, there were clearly distinct birds in each of these regions. So indigo bunting, blue jays, blue jays have different calls. The different regions picked up the different calls. But in addition to birds, we also found out that, we were clustering, we were finding insects. So there were some cicadas, there were some other insects. And then there's a region that turned out it was rainfall. So by doing self-supervised learning plus clustering, we're able to actually find signals in our data and build models then without having to do the labeling. Essentially, the self-supervised approach does the labeling for us. Another futuristic idea, everyone loves using their large language models. So we're curious, we're studying this right now, what can we push out to the edge? What models, some of the Gemini has a nano model. Some of these actually can run at the edge, but we're curious, how well do they work on the kinds of data we get? So here's an example where we said, just describe what's happening in this figure that I showed you earlier. And the language model says it shows a fire burning on the mountainside with smoke billowing, blah, 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 and it actually recognizes there's two views here. One's an infrared and the other's a regular photo. I think that's pretty interesting. It's future work. We're working on whether or not, this is another technique that might allow more scientists to be able to deploy AI algorithms out at the edge without actually having to have all the computer science expertise that is needed to actually build a bespoke AI model for each task. So we think that, putting AI out at the edge allows us to do a lot of analysis. You can move the compute out to the edge. So the AI will analyze the data. So if you think about video data, if all you're interested in is, tell me when you see, a specific animal in the scene, that's not a lot of data to transmit. Okay, I saw the raccoon at this time. That's a lot smaller amount of data than transferring all of the video. And so, we could think that this is a way to just transmit the important information and, discard all the data that is not particularly useful. And then to expand and scale this and allow more scientists to use it, we're really interested now in building approaches that make it easier for the scientist who doesn't have the computer science background or doesn't have the manpower to manually label, really large collect and label data sets. We want them to be able to answer their questions. And we're, right now exploring our language models, the way to do that. And with that, my time is up by 4 minutes. So sorry.
Thank you, Nicola.
Happily take questions.
Yeah. We have one specifically on slide 17. Someone asked, I noticed the quantized 2-bit language model used on slide 17. What kind of hardware are these edge devices working with? What are the limits for the specs that you would consider a device to be an edge device? And if you have specs, there's interest in knowing more about them.
So our nodes right now run the NVIDIA Xavier, and we're currently upgrading to the Orin. There's some issues with getting the Orin. So I don't see that there's a spec for what it means to be edge. A lot of people think, oh, you throw a Raspberry Pi out there, that's edge. But we're deploying commodity Dell blades up on a mountaintop in Florida. So edge is really, to me, the location, like that you're pushing it out to where the data is collected and you're doing the processing there. And so the NVIDIA devices are fairly powerful. But we also have these Dell blades. They're powerful devices. You can run some pretty big models on them. We're exploring that trade-off, but right now, the two devices that we actually have out in the field are these Dell blades and the NVIDIA Xaviers. We will have the Orin out soon. We're in the final stages of an upgrade, and those can run. They can run some of these models. So the example I'm showing you here was actually run on my laptop, not as we're exploring language models. But we can run some things on the Orin. We just don't have any Orins deployed right now because part of all of our infrastructure is having these devices be remote. And the way NVIDIA had set up the Orin, doing upgrades required somebody to actually go and push it. Like we can't have someone going and pushing buttons on a board. It has to all be remotely controlled. So we're working with them on some ways to be able to remotely reboot and power these devices so that they can be deployed. But yeah, the language models do run on the Orin, some pretty big models. And I can't remember off the top of my head how much GPU memories on those, but I'm sure it's online somewhere.
Can you speak more to this idea of trade-off? Because I imagine that, like in Dream of Dreams, you can run like the biggest, baddest models on these deployed devices, do essentially all of the computation there, and then like send out just like whatever you need. But I imagine there are probably some moments where you need more compute for what's actually happening at the node. So how do you balance that? How do you decide when, like what to analyze where and what to send?
So that's actually a research question that we're working on. So there are cases where, so there's two things come up. One, we have nodes and we have multiple tenants. And so sometimes some of the models are, we can run multiple models on a node, but other times the model is so big and needs everything. And so we have to deal with that. But there are cases where you want to be able to actually do some processing in the cloud. And that there's a ton of work in that space, and it's a really difficult question because you have to trade off, the latency that you'll incur by having to move stuff off the node. And so we have developed a unique scheduler that looks into the science goals. And so that has to come into play in your decision about, can I move this other compute away because, it's just doing this every 15-minute thing and I need this result right now. And that's if you think about a usual machine, there's priorities for tasks. We are trying to develop something for the edge that allows this. We do have a scheduler that we're evaluating. It looks at what the science goals are, what the requirements are, and what the resource needs are. And as part of that, we had to also develop new tools to do profiling because there really weren't custom-built profilers for edge devices. So that it opens up a big can of worms. But yeah, it's a great question. Ideally, we would be able to seamlessly move compute back and forth, but that incurs some latency and some transmission costs, and you have to take all of that into account. If you're a safety critical thing like looking for landslides or fire, you don't want to be booted. But maybe the conditions are right that you only need to run every couple of minutes, not, so it's a very difficult question you're asking to have a specific answer. We do have ongoing research in that space.
Another question that I have, I see somebody else is typing, but in the meantime, how are you especially for like wildfires or any kind of natural disasters, do you have ways of sort of integrating edge devices with emergency responders? And like, what does that interface look like?
So we don't specifically, we collaborate with UCSD and with Oregon, which has the Oregon Hazards Lab. And they do have, I mean, that's, you know, they actually work with the local first responders. So in San Diego, they have, you know, the firefighters that they will share information with. They'll deploy, you know, a helicopter, you know, when do they need to send a helicopter to go and actually look and collect data? And they actually have ways to boot people off their supercomputer to run some of their wildfire models. At Oregon, they also have, you know, the Oregon Hazard Lab works with all of, you know, the various disaster response teams. And so, yeah, that hats off, you know, that's a lot of work to get all that collaboration going and to build that relationship and trust with the first responders. So in California, they really do work pretty closely together, 3 or 4 different, you know, municipalities and agencies, because, you know, you've got to deal with local things, statewide things, county, you know, it's pretty elaborate, and they do have it all integrated so that the work that they're doing, well, you know, they're collecting data. We running our models on our infrastructure up there, but then it's all tied into these, they have very large scale models that look at, you know, the local weather, the way the wind's blowing, estimates of fuel, like how much, you know, how rapidly the fire will burn, and they will predict fire paths and share that with the first responders.
Amazing. Okay, I think one last question before we wrap. Manish asks, hi Nicola. In that cloud coverage and power production study, do you take into account the ground reflection of the irradiance? And what features do you use, like what environmental features do you use for modeling?
So in that one, we have the first round, people just labeled cloud, no cloud. In the data, and so the model was just doing a binary, is it a cloud or not? And that's actually not a very good idea, because thin wispy clouds and thick clouds, they're both clouds, but one removes a lot more solar energy hitting the solar fields than the other. So then we had to actually build a much more elaborate model that looked into not just is there a cloud or not, but you know, the relationship between what it sees, so the cloud-like stuff, you know, what kind of cloud it is, and what solar irradiance. So we had an irradiance measuring device, which is pointing upward. I don't think it looks at anything reflected from the ground, but if you're interested in what's hitting a solar panel, all that's really of interest is what's coming down from above, because this really was funded and of interest to the to Exelon for the solar production. So the second model we built took into account, you know, I would say the thickness of the cloud, although we don't actually ever measure thickness, but it had this way of correlating what it sees in the sky with how much solar energy is going to hit your devices.
Excellent, thank you. I think with that, it's 4:30, so thank you so much, Nicola, for coming and presenting today. This was really, really cool. And thank you all for sticking around. If you have any other questions about what Archit talked about today for LLMs, or what Nicola talked about today for AI at Edge, please feel free to drop things in Slack, and we will see you next week. Thank you all.
Bye.